On March 14, 2023, at 6:42 in the morning, Derek Van Horn descended 35,814 feet into the Mariana Trench, 11 degrees 22 minutes north, 142 degrees 35 minutes east, in a titanium submersible built to withstand 8 tons of pressure per square inch. At 39 years old, Derek was an accomplished technical oceanographer with deep-sea submersible certification since 2009, a consultant for National Geographic's Secrets of the Abyss series, and a man who had made 127 dives to depths most humans would never see. His camera recorded something at the bottom of Challenger Deep that violated every law of thermodynamics and marine biology. 7 distinct thermal signatures arranged in a perfect circle, each measuring 212 degrees Fahrenheit, the exact boiling point of water. At that depth, at that pressure, thermal pockets should collapse in milliseconds. These didn't. They held formation, and they moved. 3 hours after Derek surfaced, the USS Ronald Reagan, a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier conducting routine exercises 480 nautical miles away in the Philippine Sea, diverted course at full speed toward his research vessel. The timeline didn't make sense. Derek's surface crew had only transmitted their discovery 47 minutes before the first helicopter appeared on their radar. Someone had been watching. Someone had been waiting. And someone had known exactly what Derek would find down there before he ever climbed into that submersible. But to understand why the United States Navy responded with the speed and force typically reserved for nuclear incidents, you need to understand who Derek Van Horn was and why his testimony carried weight that couldn't be easily dismissed. Derek wasn't just another oceanographer chasing grant money and publishing papers. He was a former Navy chaplain who had served from 2004 to 2009, ministering to submarine crews in the Pacific Fleet. He had a graduate degree in theology from Yale Divinity School, earned in 2002, and a second degree in technical oceanography from Scripps Institution of Oceanography. His brother, Lieutenant James Van Horn, had died in 2005 when the submarine USS San Francisco collided with an underwater seamount south of Guam at full speed, 565 feet below the surface. The Navy called it a navigation error. Derek spent years studying undersea topography, trying to understand how a nuclear submarine equipped with the most sophisticated sonar systems in the world could crash into a mountain nobody knew was there. That personal tragedy drove him into a career that merged 2 seemingly incompatible fields: the rigorous empirical science of deep-sea exploration and the ancient theological texts that spoke of creatures dwelling in the abyss. Derek had published papers on extremophile organisms in Hadal zones. He had consulted on submersible safety protocols. He had 127 logged dives in the Triton 36,000/2, one of only 3 submersibles on Earth capable of reaching full ocean depth. He was married to Natalie, a marine biologist he had met at Scripps. They had 2 children, Ethan, 11 years old, and Lily, 9. They lived in a modest house in La Jolla, California, 15 minutes from the ocean. Derek was methodical, skeptical, and deeply respected in both scientific and theological academic circles. He was not the kind of man who saw things that weren't there. The mission that took him to Challenger Deep on March 14th was funded by the Omega Philanthropic Trust, a private foundation that specialized in deep ocean research. The objective was straightforward: collect sediment samples from the deepest point in the Pacific Ocean to analyze extremophile microorganisms that thrived under pressures that would crush steel like aluminum foil. The research vessel was the MV Petrel, a ship that had belonged to the estate of Paul Allen, the Microsoft co-founder who had spent millions exploring shipwrecks and ocean trenches before his death. Captain Simone Caldwell commanded the surface team, a veteran of 15 years running scientific expeditions in the Pacific. Dr. Hayes Thornton, a geophysicist from UC San Diego, was on board to analyze seismic data from a magnitude 8.2 earthquake that had struck Tonga the previous year. Kellen Ridge, the submersible technician who maintained the Triton, had worked with Derek on 43 previous dives. The weather was perfect, almost unnaturally calm for that region. Storms were common in the western Pacific, but on March 14th, the sea was glass. Derek remembers thinking it felt like the ocean was holding its breath. The descent began at 6:42 in the morning, and for the first 7 hours, everything proceeded exactly as planned. Derek had made this journey dozens of times before, sinking through layers of ocean that changed from blue to purple to black as sunlight surrendered to pressure and depth. At 10,000 feet, he passed through the midnight zone, where the last traces of surface light disappeared completely, and his submersible's external lights became the only illumination in a world that had never known day or night. At 20,000 feet, the sonar began mapping the first major geological formations, ancient volcanic ridges that had been thrust upward millions of years ago when tectonic plates collided with the force of continents. At 30,000 feet, the external temperature gauge read 35 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that any unprotected human body would go into hypothermic shock in minutes. But the real danger wasn't temperature, it was pressure, 8 tons per square inch, enough to compress human bone into fragments smaller than gravel. Derek maintained communication with the MV Petrel every 5,000 feet, his voice calm and professional as he reported depth readings, equipment status, and visual observations. Captain Simone Caldwell responded from the surface, her words slightly delayed by the acoustic transmission through 7 miles of water. Dr. Hayes Thornton monitored seismic sensors, looking for any signs of aftershock activity from the Tonga earthquake. Kellen Ridge watched the submersible's vital systems on multiple screens, tracking oxygen levels, battery power, ballast weight, and hull integrity. Everything was normal. Everything was routine. At 2:18 in the afternoon, 7 hours and 36 minutes after he began his descent, Derek's submersible touched down on the floor of Challenger Deep, 35,814 feet below the surface, the deepest point in the Pacific Ocean and the lowest elevation on the entire planet. The seafloor was soft sediment, pale gray mud that had been accumulating for millions of years, undisturbed except by the occasional deep-sea expedition. Derek activated the robotic arm and began collecting samples, filling titanium canisters with sediment that would be analyzed for bacteria that somehow survived in conditions that would kill every other known form of life. At 2:23 in the afternoon, 5 minutes after touchdown, the sonar registered something 840 feet to the southeast. The reading made no sense. Sonar at that depth typically showed rock formations, sediment layers, or the occasional scattered debris from shipwrecks that had sunk and tumbled down the continental slope over centuries. But this reading showed a biological mass, something living, something moving. That shouldn't exist. Complex multicellular life didn't survive at 35,000 feet below the surface. The pressure was too great. The temperature was too cold. There was no sunlight for photosynthesis, no oxygen for respiration, nothing but the slow rain of organic matter falling from the surface world, and even that was scarce at this depth. Derek stared at the sonar screen, watching the signature pulse and shift. Not one object. 7 separate structures arranged in a perfect circle, each approximately 40 feet in length, each emanating a faint thermal signature that registered on his instruments as warmer than the surrounding water. He made a decision. He maneuvered the submersible 220 feet closer, his hands steady on the controls despite the adrenaline beginning to flood his system. At 2:31 in the afternoon, his external cameras captured what happened next, and the footage would later be confiscated by the United States Navy and classified under national security protocols that carried a 20-year prison sentence for disclosure. The lights from his submersible illuminated something that looked like it had been ripped from the pages of Revelation and made flesh. 7 heads, each one elongated and serpentine, each one approximately 40 feet from the base of the skull to the tip of the snout. Each one moving independently but in perfect coordination, like the fingers of a hand. The heads were arranged in a circle around a central body that Derek couldn't fully see. Something massive that extended beyond the range of his lights. Something that his sonar estimated at over 600 feet in length. The heads had jaws that projected forward, filled with rows of teeth that looked like curved daggers, each tooth longer than Derek's forearm. But it was the eyes that made his breath catch in his throat. Each head had eyes that reflected his submersible's lights back at him with an iridescence that shouldn't exist in creatures that lived in perpetual darkness. A tapetum lucidum like sharks possessed, but 400 times larger, eyes that tracked his movement with an intelligence that felt ancient and hungry and aware. The bioluminescence came next, and it violated every principle of physics that Derek had learned in 15 years of deep-sea research. Bioluminescent organisms produced diffuse light, scattered photons that spread in all directions like a dim glow. But the light coming from these 7 heads wasn't diffuse. It was focused, concentrated, like searchlights or laser beams, 7 distinct beams of blue-white light that converged on the center of the circular formation, illuminating something in the darkness that Derek couldn't see clearly, something that pulsed with its own internal rhythm. Each head possessed 10 protrusions along the cranial ridge, bony structures that extended backward like horns, sharp and symmetrical. Derek's hands were shaking now as he raised his external camera to maximum magnification. His voice came through the acoustic link to the MV Petrel, strained and thin. "I need to surface. I need to surface now." Captain Simone Caldwell's response was immediate. "Derek, what's your status? What are you seeing down there?" But Derek wasn't listening anymore. He was remembering his graduate studies at Yale Divinity School, remembering late nights in the library reading texts that most modern theologians considered symbolic, metaphorical, spiritual allegories that weren't meant to be taken literally. He was remembering Revelation chapter 13, verse 1. "And I stood upon the sand of the sea, and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns. 7 heads, 10 horns on each head. Not symbolic, not metaphorical, physical. Measurable, real." At 2:34 in the afternoon, Derek Van Horn activated the emergency ascent protocol, dumping ballast weight and flooding compressed air into the buoyancy tanks. For the first time in 127 dives, his voice broke with genuine fear as he repeated into the microphone, "I need to surface. I need to surface right now." The ascent should have taken 9 hours, following strict decompression protocols that every deep-sea diver knows by heart. Protocols that exist because human tissue absorbs nitrogen under pressure, and that nitrogen has to be released slowly or it forms bubbles in the bloodstream that can cause paralysis, stroke, or death. But Derek ascended in 6 hours, skipping several mandatory decompression stops because something in his voice convinced Captain Simone Caldwell that whatever he had seen down there warranted the risk of decompression sickness over the risk of staying at depth any longer than absolutely necessary. During the ascent, Kellen Ridge monitored the sonar from the MV Petrel, watching the digital display as 7 distinct signatures followed Derek's submersible upward through the water column, maintaining a distance of approximately 400 feet, moving in perfect synchronized formation like fighter jets escorting a bomber. The signatures tracked him for 12 minutes as he rose from 35,000 feet to 28,000 feet. And then, without warning, they stopped. They didn't descend back to the seafloor. They simply disappeared from the sonar as if something had switched them off. Kellen radioed Derek to confirm he was still ascending normally, and Derek's response was barely audible over the acoustic link. 3 words spoken in a voice that sounded like a man who had just seen the architecture of his entire worldview collapse. They were following me. At 8:47 in the evening, 14 hours after his descent began, Derek's submersible broke the surface. The support crew immediately deployed the recovery crane and hauled the titanium sphere onto the deck of the MV Petrel. And when they unsealed the hatch, Derek climbed out with blood streaming from both nostrils, his eyes unfocused, his balance unsteady. He was suffering from mild decompression sickness, the inevitable consequence of ascending too quickly from 35,000 feet. But when Captain Simone asked him if he could walk to the hyperbaric chamber, he said yes. He spent the next 4 hours inside the pressurized medical chamber, breathing pure oxygen while the pressure gradually decreased to match sea-level atmosphere, a treatment that would prevent the nitrogen bubbles in his blood from causing permanent damage. But through the small porthole window, Simone could see that Derek's eyes were clear. He wasn't disoriented. He wasn't hallucinating. He was completely lucid, and that was somehow more disturbing than if he had been raving. When Derek emerged from the chamber at 12:41 in the morning on March 15th, he asked to see the footage immediately. Captain Simone Caldwell, Dr. Hayes Thornton, and Kellen Ridge gathered in the ship's main laboratory, where 3 computer monitors displayed the digital files from Derek's external cameras. Simone had spent 23 years at sea. She had seen hurricanes, rogue waves, waterspouts, bioluminescent algae blooms that turned the ocean into liquid fire. She had seen things that were rare and beautiful and terrifying in the way that nature could be terrifying when it demonstrated its complete indifference to human survival. But when she watched the footage from Challenger Deep, she didn't speak for 4 full minutes. Dr. Hayes Thornton, the geophysicist who had published 16 papers on tectonic activity and prided himself on his ability to find rational explanations for seemingly anomalous data, tried to suggest that the formations were geological, some kind of volcanic vent system producing thermal emissions that created an optical illusion in the low visibility conditions at depth. But the footage showed movement. The heads moved independently. They tracked Derek's submersible with coordinated precision. They were alive. Kellen Ridge, the submersible technician who had maintained the Triton for 8 years and understood its systems better than anyone, checked every sensor reading, every camera calibration, every data log. The equipment was functioning perfectly. There was no malfunction. There was no technical error. What Derek had filmed was exactly what the cameras had recorded. At 1:17 in the morning, Captain Simone made the decision to transmit their discovery via satellite uplink to the Omega Philanthropic Trust headquarters and to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Pacific Marine Environmental Laboratory in Seattle. The transmission included a 5-minute video excerpt, sensor data showing the thermal signatures, sonar readings, and Derek's verbal report describing what he had witnessed. The timestamp on that transmission was 0117 hours Pacific Standard Time, 1:17 in the morning. At 2:04 in the morning, 47 minutes later, Kellen spotted a helicopter on the radar, an MH-60S Seahawk, the kind the Navy used for search and rescue operations, approaching from the northeast at 8 nautical miles and closing fast. Captain Simone immediately tried to hail the aircraft on standard maritime frequencies, but received no response. The helicopter circled the MV Petrel twice, low enough that the rotor wash created whitecaps on the calm ocean surface, and then a voice came through on the military emergency channel, identifying itself as a United States Navy flight operating under authorization from Pacific Fleet Command. They were requesting permission to land personnel on the deck of the research vessel. Simone granted permission because legally she didn't have a choice. At 2:09 in the morning, the helicopter touched down and 6 people disembarked. 4 were wearing Navy working uniforms with no unit insignia patches, no name tapes, nothing that would identify which command they belonged to or what their specific roles were. 2 were civilians in dark clothing with no identification visible. The man leading the group introduced himself as Lieutenant Commander Pierce. No first name provided, no surname beyond that single word. He walked directly to Captain Simone and presented a single sheet of paper that had an official Department of Defense seal at the top, but no other identifying information. The document stated that the MV Petrel had violated a restricted military operating area, that all electronic equipment and data storage devices were subject to immediate confiscation under Title 10 United States Code Section 925, and that all personnel aboard the vessel were required to comply with national security protocols that prohibited disclosure of any information regarding activities within the restricted zone under penalty of 20 years federal imprisonment. Simone read the document twice. She had checked every navigational chart, every notice to mariners publication, every restricted area database before they departed San Diego 3 weeks earlier. There had been no restricted zone at these coordinates. Lieutenant Commander Pierce's response was brief and final. The restriction wasn't published. It's classified. You're in violation regardless of your prior research. Within 30 minutes, Pierce's team had confiscated every hard drive, every camera, every laptop computer, every GPS data logger, every satellite phone. They took Derek's personal dive logs, his handwritten notes, even the USB drives that Kellen kept as backups in his personal cabin. The official explanation was that the equipment had been operating in proximity to classified underwater sensors used for submarine detection, and that any data collected in the area could potentially compromise national security if it revealed the locations or capabilities of those sensors. It was a weak explanation. It didn't account for why a research vessel conducting openly published scientific work would suddenly be in violation of restrictions that hadn't existed when they filed their expedition plan. It didn't explain how the Navy had arrived 47 minutes after Simone transmitted her report, when the nearest carrier group, the USS Ronald Reagan and its escorts, had been 480 nautical miles away conducting exercises in the Philippine Sea. A helicopter flight from the Reagan to the MV Petrel should have taken at least 2.5 hours, but Pierce had arrived in 47 minutes. The only way that timeline made sense was if he had already been airborne, already en route, before Simone ever transmitted anything. Which meant someone had been watching. Someone had been monitoring their position in real time. Someone had known exactly what they were going to find. Lieutenant Commander Pierce and his team confined all personnel to their cabins, prohibited any external communication, and informed Captain Simone that the MV Petrel would be escorted to Pearl Harbor by the USS Sampson, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer that arrived on station 6 hours later. The voyage took 48 hours, and during that time, Derek sat in his cabin replaying everything he had seen in his mind, trying to reconcile the theological texts he had studied at Yale with the physical creature he had encountered at the bottom of the Mariana Trench. He kept coming back to the same question that Pierce had refused to answer. How did they arrive so fast? The timeline was impossible unless they had been waiting, unless they had known in advance exactly what would happen, unless the entire expedition had been orchestrated from the beginning. On March 16th, the MV Petrel docked at Pearl Harbor Naval Station, and military police separated the crew into individual holding rooms where they were interrogated for 6 hours each. The questions weren't about what they had seen. The questions were about who they had told, what communications they had sent, whether they had made copies of any data before it was confiscated. Derek was presented with a non-disclosure agreement that referenced the National Security Act of 1947 and the Espionage Act of 1917, documents that carried criminal penalties of 20 years in federal prison for unauthorized disclosure of classified information. He signed because he had 2 children and a wife life he wanted to return to, but he also noticed something that the interrogators didn't mention. The NDA had a document control number that began with the prefix Leviathan Watch-Omega. He committed that number to memory. On March 19th, 3 days after arriving at Pearl Harbor, Captain Simone, Dr. Hayes Thornton, and Derek were released and told they could return to their homes. Kellen Ridge, the submersible technician, was not released. The only explanation provided was that he required additional debriefing due to his technical knowledge of the equipment specifications. Derek never saw Kellen again. When he returned to La Jolla, California, his wife Natalie met him at the airport, and the first thing she said was that 2 men in suits had visited their house asking questions about his work, his religious background, his political affiliations, and whether he had ever expressed interest in conspiracy theories or fringe religious movements. Derek told her everything was fine, that there had been a misunderstanding with some classified Navy equipment in the area, that it would all be resolved soon. But he knew it wouldn't be resolved. He knew that whatever he had seen at Challenger Deep was something the government had been monitoring for a long time, and he knew that his discovery hadn't been accidental. In April of 2023, Derek used his connections from Yale Divinity School to reach out to Dr. Miriam Castellanos, a historian who specialized in apocalyptic and apocryphal texts that mainstream theological academia often dismissed as symbolic literature with no historical basis. He told her he needed to understand the literal descriptions of Leviathan, not the metaphorical interpretations. Dr. Castellanos sent him excerpts from the Book of Enoch, an ancient Jewish text that predated the Christian New Testament, a text that described Leviathan not as a symbol of chaos or evil, but as a physical creature that God had imprisoned in the deepest part of the ocean until the end of days. The text was specific: 7 heads, 10 horns on each head, a body so massive it could encircle the entire world, imprisoned in the abyss, the darkest and deepest chasm in the sea. Dr. Castellanos pointed out that the Mariana Trench was called Challenger Deep for a reason: deep abyss. The words were interchangeable in ancient Hebrew. Derek asked her if there had ever been any modern attempts to investigate these texts literally, to search for physical evidence of creatures described in ancient religious literature. She said there had been one expedition she was aware of, 1987, led by Noé and funded by a grant that had been quietly rescinded after 6 months. She didn't know what they had found, but the lead researcher had published nothing after that expedition and had signed a lifetime non-disclosure agreement that prevented him from discussing his work. Derek spent 2 weeks searching through archived NOAA publications until he found the name. Dr. Travis Odom, marine biologist, last known position at Oregon State University. Derek called him in May, and Travis initially refused to meet. But when Derek mentioned Challenger Deep and 7 thermal signatures, Travis went silent for 10 seconds and then said he would meet for coffee, once, off the record, and that he would deny everything if Derek ever tried to quote him publicly. They met in a diner in Portland, Oregon, on May 23, 2023. Travis was 61 years old, gray hair, tired eyes, the look of a man who had been carrying a secret for 36 years. He told Derek that the 1987 expedition had detected a massive biological anomaly at Challenger Deep using sonar systems that were far more primitive than the equipment available today. The anomaly had been stationary, dormant, producing minimal thermal output. The project was cancelled 3 months into the research phase. All funding was withdrawn, and everyone involved was required to sign NDAs that prohibited them from publishing any findings or discussing their work with colleagues. Travis said the strangest part was that the expedition hadn't been purely scientific. There had been 2 consultants on the team who weren't marine biologists or oceanographers. They were religious scholars, specialists in ancient Near Eastern texts, and they had been tasked with comparing sonar data to descriptions found in biblical and extra-biblical sources. Travis said it wasn't science. It was archaeology, but not for human civilizations. It was archaeology for something that had been documented in texts thousands of years old, something that ancient cultures had known about and feared and tried to warn future generations about through stories that modern people dismissed as mythology. Derek asked Travis if he thought the creature they had detected was the same thing Derek had filmed in 2023. Travis said he didn't think it was the same thing. He thought it was the same thing, but awake now, active, growing. And that was worse. In June of 2023, Derek received an anonymous package at his home address with no return label, no postage markings, nothing that indicated how it had been delivered. Inside were 3 photocopied pages from what appeared to be a declassified government document, except the classification stamps had been manually scratched out with black marker, making them unreadable but still visible. The header on each page read, Project Leviathan Watch, established 1952, Department of Defense in coordination with Naval Intelligence. The document described a detection event in August of 1952 when the submarine USS Redfish, conducting sonar mapping operations southwest of Guam, had recorded an acoustic signature at extreme depth that didn't match any known geological or biological phenomenon. Follow-up analysis determined the signature was biological, organic, alive. Subsequent monitoring missions between 1953 and 1987 confirmed the presence of a massive organism at the bottom of Challenger Deep, estimated length over 600 feet, exhibiting periods of dormancy lasting decades, followed by brief periods of increased activity that correlated with major seismic events in the Pacific Ring of Fire. The second page of the document contained a section titled Correlation with Religious Texts that referenced the Book of Enoch, the Book of Job, and Revelation chapter 13. It stated that multiple independent consultants from theological institutions had confirmed that the physical characteristics of the organism matched descriptions of Leviathan found in texts dating back to the 6th century before Christ. The third page was the one that made Derek's hands start shaking. It was a list of monitoring operations, dates and code names for expeditions that had been sent to Challenger Deep over the past 70 years. And at the bottom of the list, dated March 2023, was an entry that read, Operation Omega Discovery, Civilian Contractor Derek Van Horn, Submersible Descent to confirm increased activity following Tonga seismic event, January 2022. Derek stared at that line for a long time. Civilian contractor. The Omega Philanthropic Trust that had funded his expedition, the foundation that had paid for the MV Petrel, the equipment, the support team, everything. He searched for the foundation online. The website existed, professional design, mission statement about advancing deep ocean research. But when he searched for tax records, for charitable filings, for any legal documentation that nonprofits were required to maintain, he found nothing. The Omega Philanthropic Trust wasn't real. It was a shell organization, a front created by naval intelligence to fund an operation that needed to look independent, that needed to appear civilian, that needed a credible scientist with theological training to document something the government had been monitoring since 1952 but couldn't officially acknowledge without admitting they had known about it for 70 years. Derek hadn't discovered the creature. He had been sent to film it. And if the information ever leaked, if anyone ever tried to make the footage public, the government could discredit him by pointing to his religious background, his Yale divinity degree, his published papers on theology and oceanography, and they could say he had seen what he wanted to see, that he had projected his religious beliefs onto ambiguous sonar data and low-visibility camera footage. They had built plausible deniability into the mission from the beginning by choosing a scientist who could be dismissed as biased. Derek realized he had been used. He had been a pawn in a 71-year-old operation to monitor something that should not exist, and now he was the disposable witness who could be quietly discredited if the truth ever threatened to surface. The consequences for Derek Van Horn began in July of 2023 when National Geographic quietly terminated his consulting contract for the Secrets of the Abyss series, citing budget restructuring and a shift in programming focus. It was a polite corporate excuse that didn't explain why they had just renewed his contract for 2 additional seasons 4 months earlier. In August, Scripps Institution of Oceanography informed him that his position as associate researcher would not be renewed, again blaming budget cuts despite the fact that the institution had just received a $43 million grant from the National Science Foundation. In September, the Internal Revenue Service opened a full audit of Derek's personal finances going back 7 years, requesting documentation for every deduction, every business expense, every charitable donation. Tax audits were supposed to be random, but Derek knew this wasn't random. This was pressure. This was the government reminding him that they could make his life very difficult if he chose to speak publicly about what he had seen. His wife Natalie asked for a temporary separation in October, not because she doubted him, but because she couldn't handle the constant surveillance anymore. The cars parked on their street that didn't belong to neighbors. The phone calls that connected and then went silent. The feeling that someone was always watching, always listening. Ethan and Lily were old enough to notice their mother's anxiety, and Natalie made the decision to take the children to stay with her parents in Oregon until the situation resolved itself, if it ever did. Kellen Ridge, the submersible technician who had been detained at Pearl Harbor for additional debriefing, reappeared in November of 2023. He had a new job working for the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency in Arlington, Virginia, a position that paid 3 times his previous salary and required a top-secret security clearance. He wouldn't return calls from his former colleagues. He wouldn't discuss the Challenger Deep expedition. He had been silenced with money and access, converted from potential whistleblower to complicit insider. But Derek wasn't the only person who had seen something unusual in the waters near the Mariana Trench. In October of 2023, a fisherman named Mateo Santos from the island of Guam posted a video on Facebook showing strange lights moving in a circular pattern beneath the surface of the ocean approximately 60 miles southwest of his position. The video was grainy, shot on a smartphone at night, but the lights were visible. 7 distinct points of blue-white illumination rotating slowly in perfect formation. The video was shared 1,100 times in 2 days before it was removed for violating community standards, though Facebook never specified which standards had been violated. Mateo's account was suspended permanently. In December of 2023, a document appeared on WikiLeaks, a 3-page internal memorandum from NOAA's Pacific Marine Environmental Laboratory dated May of 2023, 2 months after Derek's dive. The memo recommended expanding the permanent exclusion zone around Challenger Deep from 5 nautical miles to 25 nautical miles due to what it called anomalous seismic activity patterns that may indicate increased volcanic instability. The language was careful, bureaucratic, designed to sound like routine geological monitoring. But geophysicists who reviewed the memo pointed out that Challenger Deep was not located near any active volcanic systems, and that seismic activity alone wouldn't justify such a dramatic expansion of restricted maritime zones. In January of 2024, a commercial satellite operated by Planet Labs captured thermal imaging data of the Challenger Deep region as part of a routine ocean temperature mapping survey. The images showed a circular thermal anomaly at extreme depth, approximately 600 feet in diameter, with 7 distinct hotspots arranged around the perimeter. The temperature differential was small, only 3 to 4 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the surrounding water, but the pattern was unmistakable. 7 points. Perfect circle. The data was published in an open-access scientific journal, and within 72 hours, the journal received a request from the Department of Defense to retract the images due to national security concerns. The journal complied. In February of 2024, military analysts and submarine enthusiasts began discussing an incident that had occurred in October of 2021, more than a year before Derek's dive. The USS Connecticut, a Seawolf-class nuclear submarine that cost $3.4 billion to build and carried some of the most sophisticated sonar and navigation systems ever developed, had struck what the Navy called an uncharted underwater seamount while operating in the Indo-Pacific region. The collision was severe enough to damage the submarine's forward section and force it to surface for emergency repairs. 11 sailors were injured. The Navy refused to disclose the exact location of the incident, citing operational security, but several defense publications reported that the Connecticut had been operating in the vicinity of the Mariana Trench at the time. Submarine veterans and analysts found this explanation difficult to accept. The Mariana Trench was one of the most heavily studied and thoroughly mapped regions of the Pacific Ocean. The idea that a $3 billion submarine equipped with active sonar, passive sonar, gravimetric sensors, and access to real-time oceanographic data could collide with an uncharted seamount in that area was almost laughable. Unless it hadn't been a seamount, unless it had been something moving, something alive, something 600 feet long that the Navy had been tracking since 1952. In March of 2024, NOAA issued a permanent notice to mariners declaring the Challenger Deep region a restricted maritime zone closed to all civilian vessels indefinitely. The official reason was environmental protection and ongoing scientific research. No additional details were provided. In April, the Navy installed 3 acoustic monitoring buoys in a triangular formation surrounding the exclusion zone. The buoys were described as part of a marine mammal research project studying whale migration patterns, which made no sense because there were no migratory whale populations at that depth or in that region. In May of 2024, the United States Geological Survey reported that seismic activity in the Mariana Trench region had increased by 340% compared to the 30-year average. They attributed the increase to normal tectonic adjustments following the Tonga earthquake of January 2022. They did not explain why the increased activity was concentrated specifically around Challenger Deep and not distributed evenly along the plate boundary. Derek Van Horn still lives in La Jolla, California. He works as a private consultant for marine engineering firms, reviewing dive safety protocols and equipment specifications. He has not returned to deep-sea submersible diving. He has not spoken publicly about what he saw on March 14, 2023. He is bound by legal agreements that carry criminal penalties, and he has children to protect and a life that he wants to keep. But he thinks about it every day. The question that keeps him awake at night is this: if the United States government has been monitoring the creature in Challenger Deep since 1952, if they've known about it for 71 years, then why did they allow him to descend in March of 2023? They had 7 decades to declare that region permanently off-limits. They had 7 decades to prevent civilian researchers from getting anywhere near it. But they didn't. They funded his expedition through a shell organization. They equipped him with cameras and sent him down to film it. And the only reason that makes sense is that they wanted documentation. They wanted a civilian witness with credentials who could provide evidence that the creature was real, that it was active, that it was exactly what ancient texts had described for thousands of years. But why would the government want that evidence if they had spent 70 years keeping it secret? Unless something had changed. Unless the monitoring data had shown something new, something that made them believe the information would eventually become impossible to hide. And that leads to the final page of the leaked Project Leviathan Watch document, the page that Derek keeps in a locked drawer in his home office, the page that he reads over and over, even though it makes his hands shake every time. The document included a section titled Projected Timeline Based on Growth Rate Analysis. It stated that the organism at Challenger Deep had been measured at 412 feet in length when first detected in 1952. Follow-up measurements in 1987 showed 493 feet. Measurements in 2023 showed 627 feet. The growth rate was accelerating. The document concluded with a single line in bold text. Estimated date of full emergence from substrate based on current growth trajectory, 2031 to 2033. Emergence, not movement, not migration. Emergence. The creature wasn't going to swim away. It was going to rise. And when Derek thinks about that word, when he remembers the 7 heads tracking his submersible with focused intelligence, when he remembers the thermal signatures and the bioluminescent beams and the 10 horns on each skull, he wonders what emergence means. Emergence from the deepest point in the ocean. Emergence into shallower waters. Emergence into a world that has spent 2,000 years treating the Book of Revelation as symbolic prophecy instead of tactical warning. The creature is down there right now, 35,814 feet below the surface, monitored by acoustic sensors and satellites and submarines that can't get close enough to do anything except watch. And it's growing. And it's waking up. And somewhere in a classified facility, people who have access to 71 years of data know exactly when it will emerge. They know the timeline. They know what's coming. But they're not telling anyone. They're just watching. And waiting. And the rest of us are supposed to go about our lives as if the abyss isn't about to give up something that should have stayed buried forever.